The Arizona desert of 1952 brought the most merciless drought the Sonoran region had witnessed in 5 decades. Temperatures soared to 115 degrees as relentless sun baked the parched earth, turning the landscape into a furnace. It was in these unforgiving conditions that Caroline Thornton found herself alone in a dilapidated ranch house. Her husband, 2 weeks in the ground with 4 hungry children who depended entirely on her for survival. Their well running dry and hope fading with each passing hour, Caroline had resigned herself to the grim fate that seemed inevitable, until shadows appeared at her door. An Apache family, led by a medicine man named Thomas Redbird, seeking shelter from an unexpected blizzard, would discover not only a family on the brink of tragedy, but also an extraordinary gift in Caroline that would transform countless lives. In the valley, if only they could survive the night. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Caroline Thornton stared through the cracked window of the small ranch house, watching as the unexpected winter storm brought snow to the desert, a bizarre climatic shift that the locals would later call the Sonoran Miracle. Just 1 month earlier, her life had held such promise. She and her husband Frank had moved from Chicago to the Arizona countryside, with dreams of raising their children in the desert air, while Frank worked as a cattle rancher for a wealthy landowner. The modest property they'd purchased sat on the edge of a picturesque valley, with spectacular views of the distant mountains, and Frank had spent the autumn reinforcing the old ranch house to withstand both desert heat and occasional cold snaps. The nearest town, Copper Springs, was a 50-minute drive in good conditions, a fact that had seemed adventurous during their summer visits and now loomed as a potential death sentence. Frank had never lived to see the winter arrive. 2 weeks after signing the final paperwork on their ranch, he had collapsed while digging a new irrigation channel, a heart attack taking his life in seconds. Caroline, still adjusting to life in the desert with 4 children, 10-year-old, twins Sarah and Samuel, 7-year-old Elijah and 3-year-old Hannah, had found him face down in the dirt. By some miracle, she had managed to get his body into their truck and drive the treacherous road to Copper Springs. The children were confused and frightened in the back seat, their faces streaked with tears they couldn't afford to shed in a land where water was more precious than gold. The small-town funeral had been a blur, faces of strangers offering condolences to a woman they barely knew. Sheriff Bennett had arranged for Frank to be buried in the town cemetery just as the weather forecasters were noting a strange meteorological phenomenon approaching. A cold front unlike anything the region had seen in decades, a system that defied all predictions. "We'll be fine," she had told them with a confidence she didn't feel. "We have plenty of supplies." It was a complete lie. They had food for perhaps 3 days if she rationed carefully. Their well had been producing less water each day, the drought having lowered the water table beyond their pump's reach. The emergency barrels Frank had filled held enough for maybe 4 days of minimal use. The firewood, thankfully, was well stocked, a precaution Frank had insisted on despite moving to the desert. Now, 4 days after the funeral, nature had played its cruelest joke. The blistering heat had given way to an unprecedented cold snap, with temperatures plummeting from triple digits to below freezing in a matter of hours. Snow, actual snow, had begun to fall on the desert, an event so rare that the oldest residents of Copper Springs couldn't recall seeing more than a dusting in their lifetimes. "Mommy," Sarah's small voice pulled Caroline from her dark thoughts. "I'm thirsty." Caroline forced a smile, turning away from the window. "I know, sweetheart. Let's find something to drink, but remember, just small sips." The twins nodded. Their thin faces solemn beneath matching brown hair, they had their father's eyes, deep blue and thoughtful. Caroline had caught them staring at Frank's empty chair during breakfast, but the children had asked no questions. At 10, they seemed to understand more than Caroline could explain. "Can we have some of the orange juice?" Samuel asked, referring to the last can of frozen concentrate they had been saving. Caroline hesitated. The orange juice was one of their few sources of both liquid and vitamin C. She had been saving it for an emergency. Then again, what was this if not an emergency? "Sure, honey. Orange juice sounds perfect for a cold day." As Caroline moved to the small kitchen area, little Hannah began to fuss in her makeshift play area, a corner padded with blankets that sat near the kitchen table. Frank had planned to build a proper play set outside, but time had run out. Caroline lifted her daughter, cradling her against her shoulder as she opened the cupboard with her free hand. 5 cans of food remained, including the orange juice concentrate. Some pasta, a half-empty bag of rice, a few potatoes with eyes sprouting, and 2 onions completed their non-perishable food supply. The refrigerator held milk that was turning sour, some eggs, butter, and a package of bacon Caroline had been saving. Outside, the snow fell with unexpected fury, accumulating on the desert floor where it had no business being. "Sarah, can you be my special helper and get the blanket from your bed, the thick one Grandma made?" Sarah nodded and scampered off to the ranch house's second bedroom. Caroline had been sleeping on the sofa since Frank died, unable to face the empty side of their bed. As Sarah returned, dragging the heavy patchwork quilt, Caroline felt a wave of bone-deep exhaustion. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since Frank's death, constantly waking to check on the children or to worry about their dwindling supplies. The unexpected cold meant they needed to use precious firewood to keep from freezing in a house designed to stay cool in the desert heat. "Are we going to build a blanket fort?" Elijah asked, his face brightening slightly at the prospect of an adventure. "That's a wonderful idea," Caroline replied, grateful for her son's resilience. "We'll make one big enough for all 5 of us." They spent the next hour arranging blankets and pillows in front of the fireplace, creating a small world where the harsh reality outside couldn't reach them. Caroline mixed the orange juice concentrate with their rationed water, pouring small amounts into cups for each child. "Drink slowly," she reminded them. "We need to make it last." After their meager lunch, Caroline checked their firewood supply. The indoor stack would last perhaps 2 days if she was careful. More wood was stacked against the exterior wall of the ranch house, but accessing it meant braving the unexpected blizzard. She would wait until absolutely necessary. As afternoon faded toward evening, the temperature inside the ranch house began to drop. Caroline added more wood to the fire and wrapped the children in extra layers. Their home, built for desert heat, with its high ceilings and adobe walls, now worked against them, the cold seeping in through every crack. While the children napped in their blanket fort, Caroline wrote in the journal she'd kept since moving to Arizona. The familiar routine brought a small measure of comfort. December 12th, 1952. Nature has played the cruelest trick imaginable. After months of drought that nearly dried our well, we're now facing a blizzard in the desert. The radio stopped working this morning. Our food will last maybe 3 days if I eat very little. The children are being so brave, but I see the fear in their eyes. Frank would have known what to do. She stopped writing, unwilling to complete the thought that haunted her. Without help, they wouldn't survive the week. Caroline turned to a fresh page and began listing their remaining supplies, searching for options she might have overlooked. Outside, darkness fell early, as it did in the desert winter. The wind increased in intensity, howling around the ranch house's eaves like a living thing seeking entry. Caroline added more wood to the fire and heated bottles of water that she tucked into the blankets around the children. By 8 p.m., all 4 children were asleep in the blanket fort, and Caroline allowed herself to collapse onto the sofa, her head throbbing with tension and hunger. She had eaten only a few bites of food, saving the rest for her children. Sleep pulled at her, but she fought it, afraid of the fire dying down too far. A sudden, sharp knock jolted her upright. For a moment she thought she had imagined it. Then came another knock, followed by voices speaking a language she didn't recognize. Caroline looked toward the door in alarm, uncertain whether to answer or hide with her children. Before she could decide, Elijah had awakened and ran to the door. "Someone's here, Mummy! Help has come!" "Elijah, no!" Caroline called, trying to rise and failing as exhaustion overwhelmed her. Through blurred vision, she watched in horror as her 7-year-old struggled with the door latch, finally pulling it open to reveal several figures silhouetted against the snow-filled darkness. A man stepped inside, bringing a blast of frigid air and swirling snowflakes. "Hello," he called, his voice deep and accented. "We saw smoke from your chimney. Our truck couldn't make it further in this storm, and—" He stopped abruptly as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, and he took in the scene. 4 children in rumpled clothes, a makeshift fort near a dying fire, and a woman struggling to rise, exhaustion evident in every movement. "You need help?" he stated simply, turning to gesture to the figures behind him. 3 more people entered, a woman about Caroline's age, an elderly man, and a teenage boy. All were dressed in warm layers that seemed remarkably well-suited to the unexpected cold, their features marking them as Apache. "I am Thomas Redbird," the first man said, his tone shifting to something calm and authoritative. "This is my wife Mary, my father Jacob, and my son William. We were returning to our home when the storm caught us." He glanced at the children, then back to Caroline. "It seems the Creator has brought us together on this night." Caroline tried to focus on the stranger's face, but darkness was closing in from the edges of her vision. The last thing she registered before consciousness slipped away was the gentle strength of his hands as he guided her back to the sofa, and the strange sense that, against all probability, help had arrived in the form of a family stranded in the same impossible desert blizzard that had nearly killed them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas Redbird hadn't planned on being stranded in an Arizona blizzard during the most bizarre weather event in decades. Just 6 hours earlier, he'd been at the tribal clinic in White River, finishing his weekly visit where he assisted the reservation's only doctor with traditional medicine consultations. His family had accompanied him on this trip, a rare opportunity to combine his healing work with a chance for his son William to learn about their heritage. The Weather Bureau's forecast had seemed impossible. Snow in the Sonoran Desert in December. Yet his father, Jacob, whose weathered face held 90 years of desert wisdom, had nodded solemnly. "The signs have been there for those who know how to read them. The desert prepares to receive a blessing from the sky." That vote of confidence now seemed like ancient wisdom as Thomas assessed the dire situation before him. The woman, Caroline, according to the twins, who'd introduced themselves as Sarah and Samuel, had passed out from exhaustion and hunger. Her skin was dry, dehydration evident even in the desert's rare humidity. The children showed similar signs, though less severe. The smallest child, Hannah, was listless in Mary's arms, her tiny body too quiet for a 3-year-old. 7-year-old Elijah stood protectively near his mother, watching the strangers with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Thomas worked methodically, the way his father had taught him. First priorities: warmth, water, and assessment. He stoked the dying fire, adding the last pieces of indoor firewood until the flames glowed with renewed heat. Then he gestured to his son. "William, bring in our emergency supplies from the truck, the water containers first." The teenager nodded, pulling his coat tighter before heading back into the storm. Mary had already settled on the floor with Hannah, humming a soft Apache lullaby while checking the child for fever. Elijah, Thomas said, keeping his voice gentle for the wary boy. Can you show me where your mother keeps clean towels and drinking cups? The boy nodded, seemingly relieved to have a task. He led Thomas to a small closet where he found basic household supplies. Good job, he told him. Now, is there any more? Food in the house besides what I see in the kitchen? Elijah's face fell. It's all gone. Mommy keeps giving us her share, but there's hardly anything left. Thomas understood the situation immediately. A widow, alone with 4 children, their supplies, dwindling in a house designed for heat rather than cold, caught unprepared by a freak winter storm. It was a recipe for tragedy without intervention. William returned with their supplies, several gallons of water in metal containers, emergency rations, extra blankets, and herbal medicines that Jacob had insisted they bring. Within 20 minutes, the atmosphere in the small ranch house had transformed. The fire blazed steadily, water was heating for tea, and all 4 children had taken small sips from canteens. Caroline stirred on the sofa, her eyes fluttering open in confusion. The children, she began immediately, are safe and getting warmer, Thomas assured her, bringing a cup of water to her lips. Drink slowly. You're dehydrated. She obeyed, her gaze moving from Thomas to the others, clearly processing this unexpected development. You're Apache, she stated simply, neither judgment nor question in her tone. Yes, Thomas replied, from the White Mountain Reservation near White River. We were returning home when the storm caught us. Our truck couldn't make it any further in these conditions. Jacob, who had been quietly arranging herbs near the fire, looked up with keen dark eyes. The Creator guided our steps to your door. This is no accident. Caroline struggled to sit up, and Thomas helped her with gentle efficiency. My husband died 2 weeks ago, she explained, her voice strengthening. We weren't prepared for any of this. She gestured vaguely to encompass both their circumstances and the impossible weather outside. Few would be prepared for snow in the desert, Mary commented, still holding Hannah, who had fallen asleep in her arms. This weather defies memory. Even my father-in-law's, and he has seen 9 decades of desert seasons. Thomas turned his attention back to Caroline. How long has it been since you had a proper meal? She hesitated, embarrassment crossing her features. I've been stretching everything for the children. Maybe 3 days, since I had more than scraps. Mary exchanged a concerned glance with Thomas. I'll prepare something, she said decisively, handing the sleeping Hannah to William, who accepted. His small charge with surprising tenderness. From their emergency supplies, Mary extracted dried meat, preserved corn, wild rice, and herbs. Though they had planned these rations for their own journey home, the Redbird family shifted priorities without discussion. These children and their mother needed immediate nourishment. As Mary worked at the small kitchen stove, combining their traditional foods with what little remained in Caroline's pantry, Thomas tended to the practical aspects of their situation. Using a small hand-cranked radio from their supplies, he attempted to get weather updates. But the storm interfered with reception. The tracks are already covered, William reported after checking outside, and the truck is getting buried. Thomas nodded, accepting this reality. We'll be here until the storm passes, perhaps longer. Caroline watched these strangers efficiently, take control of a situation she had feared was hopeless, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her face, relief, gratitude, and perhaps a touch of shame at her own failure to provide for her children without help. Why were you traveling in such conditions? She asked finally. My father serves as a medicine man at several clinics, William explained proudly. The reservation doctor works with him, combining our traditional healing with modern medicine. Jacob, who had been quietly preparing herbs by the fire, looked up. My son walks in 2 worlds, he said, his English accented but clear. educated in your schools, but trained in our ways, the best of both paths. While they spoke, Mary returned with bowls of a hearty stew. The rich aroma filled the small house, causing the twins to stir from their place in the blanket fort. The food was simple but nourishing. Dried meat rehydrated with vegetables and wild rice, seasoned with herbs that gave it a complex, unfamiliar flavor. Caroline took her first spoonful hesitantly, then began to eat with increasing urgency as her body recognized the nourishment it desperately needed. The children followed suit, their initial wariness of the strange food forgotten at the first taste. "This is really good," Samuel declared, reaching for a second helping. "It's traditional Pinda lichen, white man's stew," Mary explained with a small smile. "Our version of the government rations, but made palatable with our own additions." As they ate, Thomas explained their situation more fully. His family had been returning from the clinic visit when the weather deteriorated rapidly. Their truck, though sturdy, couldn't navigate safely through the accumulating snow on unfamiliar desert roads. They had seen the smoke from Caroline's chimney and decided to seek shelter, following what Jacob called the path laid before them. "We'll be stranded until the snow melts or the roads are cleared," Thomas concluded. "But together we have enough. Supplies to manage for several days." The meal had revitalized Caroline visibly. Color returned to her cheeks, and her movements grew more certain. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "If you hadn't come—" She glanced at her children, leaving the sentence unfinished. "There is no need for thanks between people sharing the same storm," Jacob replied, with the serene confidence of his years. "The desert teaches us that survival is not for the solitary. Even the cactus shelters smaller lives within its shade." As evening deepened, they established sleeping arrangements. The Redbird family insisted that Caroline and her children keep the bedrooms, while they would make do with their bedrolls near the fire. Thomas went outside one last time to secure their truck and bring in additional supplies, returning with frost clinging to his dark hair. "The temperature is dropping further," he reported, "and the wind is building. This will be a difficult night." With the practical matters addressed, an awkward silence fell as the two families, strangers thrust together by circumstance, found themselves sharing intimate domestic space. The cultural divide seemed suddenly more apparent in the quiet. It was young Elijah who bridged the gap, approaching Jacob with the directness of childhood. "Sir, why do you have those little bags hanging from your belt?" The elderly man smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "Medicine pouches," he explained, untying one small leather bag to show the boy. "This one holds hodentin, sacred pollen that brings blessing and protection." Elijah leaned closer, fascinated. "Like magic?" "Like prayer made visible," Jacob corrected gently, "a reminder that we walk in a world filled with power beyond what we can see." As Jacob began showing Elijah his collection of herbs and explaining their uses in simple terms, Thomas observed Caroline watching the interaction. He recognized her expression, the cautious curiosity of someone encountering unfamiliar cultural practices, uncertain whether to embrace or distance herself from them. "My father has been a healer for nearly 70 years, Thomas explained quietly. "The government tried to forbid our traditional practices when he was young, but many of our ways survived in secret. Now, some of the reservation doctors work with our medicine people, acknowledging that both approaches have value." Caroline nodded slowly. "Frank, my husband, he always said that wisdom doesn't belong to just one culture." Her voice faltered slightly on her husband's name. "He would have been fascinated by your father's knowledge." "And what did you think before tonight?" Thomas asked directly. Caroline considered the question honestly. "I never gave it much thought. We lived in Chicago before coming here. Everything about the desert was foreign to us." She glanced toward her children, now gathered around Jacob as he showed them different herbs from his medicine bags. "This wasn't the life we planned." "Few receive the exact life they plan," Thomas replied. "The question is whether we can find purpose in the one we're given." Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, rattling the windows in their frames. Inside, two families from vastly different worlds had found unexpected sanctuary together, their immediate future as uncertain as the peculiar weather that had brought them to this moment. As the children finally settled into sleep, warmer and with full stomachs for the first time in days, Thomas caught his father watching Caroline with thoughtful eyes. When he asked what was on his mind, Jacob simply nodded toward the sleeping woman. "She carries a gift she doesn't yet recognize," the old man said cryptically. "The desert has called her for a reason." Thomas didn't press for an explanation. His father's insights often became clear only with time. For now, they had survived the first critical night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also, perhaps, new understanding. Dawn broke with unusual brilliance, the rising sun transforming the snow-covered desert into a landscape of diamonds. Caroline woke to the unfamiliar sound of quiet singing, a melodic, rhythmic chant coming from near the fireplace. Opening her eyes, she found Jacob Redbird seated cross-legged before the freshly stoked fire, his weathered hands sprinkling something into the flames as he sang in Apache. She watched, silently, not wanting to interrupt what was clearly a sacred ritual. The old man's face was serene, illuminated by the fire's glow, his eyes closed in concentration. The strange beauty of the moment stirred something in Caroline, a recognition of reverence that transcended her understanding of the specific. "Practices. Morning prayers," Thomas explained quietly, appearing at her side with a steaming cup. "My father greets each day by giving thanks and asking for guidance." Caroline accepted the offered drink, a tea of some kind, fragrant with unfamiliar herbs. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You haven't," Thomas assured her. "Prayer is meant to be witnessed. It reminds us we're not alone in seeking connection with something greater than ourselves." The tea was surprisingly pleasant, earthy and slightly sweet, with a hint of mint. As Caroline sipped it, she felt a subtle warmth spreading through, her body easing the stiffness in her muscles. "This is wonderful," she murmured. "What is it?" "Desert sage, creosote and wildflower honey," Thomas replied. "Good for restoring strength after hardship." Beyond the windows, the snow continued to fall, though less intensely than the previous night. The world outside remained transformed. Cacti wore whitecaps, and the normally brown landscape was buried under several inches of pristine snow. It was beautiful and terrifying in its strangeness. The children were still sleeping, her four, clustered together in the blanket fort, and William curled in a bedroll near his parents' makeshift bed. Only Jacob and Thomas were awake, preparing for the day ahead while Mary slept. "The radio is working better this morning," Thomas informed her, his voice low to avoid waking the others. "The storm is expected to continue through today, with temperatures remaining below freezing until tomorrow afternoon. Roads won't be passable for at least 2 days after that." Caroline processed this information, calculating what it meant for their situation. "So we're looking at potentially 4 or 5 days. Together," Thomas nodded, "at minimum. Is that a problem?" The question was direct, but not confrontational. Caroline considered it honestly. "A week ago, I would have been terrified at the prospect of sheltering strangers," she admitted. "But after last night, I'm just grateful you're here." Jacob had finished his prayers and now joined their quiet conversation. "The desert teaches harsh lessons about interdependence," he said. "Even the most solitary creatures know when to seek help." As the morning progressed, the rest of the household stirred. The children emerged from their various sleeping places, shy at first in the light of a new day with these strangers, but quickly warming as Mary prepared a breakfast of corn cakes sweetened with the last of Caroline's honey. "We need to assess our situation and make plans," Thomas said once everyone had eaten. "First priority is water and heat." Caroline explained their water situation, the well that had been gradually failing during the drought, now likely frozen. In the pipes, the emergency barrels were nearly empty after months of careful rationing. "The snow is a blessing then," Jacob declared. "We will harvest it and melt it for drinking." William and Thomas set up a collection system using tarps from their truck to gather clean snow, while Mary worked with the twins to organize the remaining food supplies and take inventory. Caroline, feeling stronger after a night of proper rest and 2 solid meals, addressed the heating situation with Elijah's help. "There's more firewood stacked behind the house," she explained to Thomas, "but I wasn't strong enough to bring it in by myself." Together, they cleared a path to the woodpile, which had been partially protected by the house's overhang. The physical labor in the cold air was demanding, but Caroline found herself able to work steadily alongside Thomas, carrying smaller loads while he managed the heavier pieces. "You're regaining your strength quickly," he observed as they stacked the wood inside the mudroom. "I didn't realize how much the hunger and worry had affected me," Caroline admitted. "Having help, it makes everything feel possible again." By midday, their immediate concerns had been addressed. They had water from melted snow, enough firewood for several days, and a clearer picture of their food supplies. Working together, the 2 families had transformed a desperate situation into a manageable one. As the adults conferred about rationing plans, Jacob took all 5 children to the front room and began what appeared to be an impromptu lesson. Using small objects from his medicine pouch, stones, carved wooden figures, and dried plants, he created a miniature landscape on the floor. "This is how our people have survived in harsh lands for thousands of years," he explained, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a storyteller. "By understanding the desert as a living thing, with its own patterns and gifts." Caroline paused her conversation with Thomas and Mary to watch. Her children, especially Elijah, were captivated by the old man's teaching. Jacob demonstrated how certain plants indicated the presence of water beneath the surface, how to read weather patterns in cloud formations, and how animals adapted to extreme conditions. "He's remarkable with them," she commented softly. Mary smiled with obvious pride. "My father-in-law was a teacher before becoming a full-time medicine man. Children have always responded to his wisdom." Thomas added, "These are survival skills our people have refined over generations. Your children might benefit from such knowledge living out here." The casual comment struck Caroline forcefully. Until this moment, she hadn't fully committed to staying in Arizona after Frank's death. Chicago, with its familiar surroundings and her parents' nearby support, had been a tempting escape route once the initial shock of widowhood had passed. But watching her children absorb Jacob's teachings about the very land she had considered fleeing, she felt a subtle shift in her perspective. As afternoon progressed, the lesson moved from theory to practice. Jacob, despite his 90 years, insisted on taking the older children outside briefly to show them how to identify which snow was cleanest for collection, how to spot potential shelter locations, and how to mark trails to prevent getting lost. "We won't go far," he assured Caroline, who looked concerned. "Just around the immediate yard. They need to understand their environment, especially in unusual conditions like these." Against her city-bred instincts, Caroline agreed. Thomas accompanied them as a precaution, while she remained inside with Mary and Hannah, the youngest still too small for the adventure. While they worked together, preparing a stew from their combined supplies, Mary spoke casually about her family. Thomas was educated at a government school, then attended community college to study nursing. But he always maintained his connection to our traditional ways through his father. And now he combines both. Caroline asked, curious about this bridging of worlds. Mary nodded. He works with the reservation clinic 3 days a week, helping patients who want traditional remedies alongside Western medicine. The other days he travels to outlying communities or gathers healing plants in the mountains. Is that accepted by the medical community? Increasingly so, Mary replied, stirring the pot thoughtfully. Some doctors still dismiss our practices as superstition, but others have seen the results, particularly for chronic conditions where Western medicine manages symptoms but doesn't address underlying imbalances. Caroline considered this perspective, so different from her urban experience where doctors' pronouncements were treated as absolute truth. What about William? Will he follow the same path? A shadow crossed Mary's face. That path has become more complicated. Our young people are pulled between worlds, the traditional ways that sustained us for generations, and the modern world, with its opportunities and distractions. There was worry in her voice, a mother's concern that resonated deeply with Caroline. Despite their different backgrounds, they shared the universal desire to see their children find their way in an uncertain world. The outdoor expedition returned, cheeks red with cold, but eyes bright with excitement. Elijah was particularly animated, clutching several items he'd collected under Jacob's guidance: a piece of creosote bush, a snow-covered feather, and what appeared to be a small arrowhead. "Look, Mom," he exclaimed, rushing to Caroline. "Mr. Jacob showed us how to find these. The arrowhead was just sitting there in the snow like it was waiting for me." Jacob smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. He has good eyes. The snow reveals what is normally hidden beneath sand and brush. As Elijah proudly displayed his treasures, Caroline noticed something surprising. Her normally hyperactive 7-year-old was focused and calm, listening attentively as Jacob explained the significance of each item. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. "He responds well to your father's teaching," she commented quietly to Thomas while the children gathered around the fire to warm up. "Jacob has that effect on people," Thomas acknowledged. "He sees what each person needs, sometimes before they know it themselves." That evening, as the strange desert blizzard continued outside, the two families shared another meal together. The conversation flowed more easily now, the initial awkwardness between strangers giving way to the natural camaraderie of shared circumstance. The children, particularly the twins and William, had formed a tentative friendship, comparing their vastly different life experiences with the fascinating discovery that despite growing up in entirely different worlds, they shared many of the same interests and concerns. After the meal, as they sat before the fire sipping pine needle tea that Mary had prepared, Jacob asked Caroline about her life before Arizona. "Chicago," she replied. "I was a botanical illustrator for the Natural History Museum. Frank was an agricultural engineer. We met when he came to consult on an exhibit about sustainable farming practices." "Botanical illustrator?" Jacob's eyes brightened with interest. "You understand plants well enough to capture their essence on paper?" Caroline nodded, surprised by his enthusiasm. "I specialized in medicinal and edible species. My grandfather was a pharmacist who kept an extensive herb garden. He taught me to observe the minute details that distinguish related plants." The old man exchanged a significant glance with Thomas. "Tomorrow," Jacob said with surprising authority, "I would like to see your work if you have any with you." Yes, I have my portfolio." "But why?" "Because," Jacob interrupted gently, "sometimes what we think of as mere talent is actually a doorway to deeper understanding. Your connection to plants may be more significant than you realize." The cryptic statement hung in the air. As the fire crackled and snow continued to fall outside, transforming the desert world into something none of them had experienced before, a blank canvas where new possibilities waited to be discovered. The second day of their unexpected cohabitation dawned with the snow still falling, though the winds had calmed. Caroline woke early, her mind lingering on Jacob's cryptic interest in her botanical illustrations. She slipped quietly from the bedroom where she had slept with Hannah, careful not to wake her youngest child. In the main room, she found Thomas already awake, adding wood to the fire. The rest of the household remained asleep, the early hour bathing the ranch house in a peaceful silence, broken only by the soft crackling of flames. "Good morning," he greeted her quietly. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have since Frank died," she admitted. "I think knowing we're not alone has lifted some weight." Thomas nodded, understanding. "Would you like coffee? We've been rationing it, but there's enough for a small cup each." As they sat with their precious coffee, the last of her supply mixed with something Thomas had brought that extended it with chicory and roasted herbs, Caroline retrieved her portfolio from a trunk in the corner. The leather case had been untouched since their move, a connection to her former life that had seemed increasingly irrelevant in the harsh reality of desert widowhood. "Your father seemed very interested in my drawings," she said, unbuckling the worn straps. "He sees connections others miss." Thomas replied carefully, "particularly when it comes to people who have affinity with the natural world." Caroline spread several illustrations across the small dining table, detailed renderings of plants in various stages of growth, executed with scientific precision, but also a delicate artistic sensibility that captured each plant's distinct character. Some were familiar garden herbs, others rare specimens from conservatories, each depicted with meticulous attention to the smallest details of leaf structure, root systems, and flowering patterns. Thomas studied them with evident appreciation. "These are extraordinary, not just accurate, but somehow alive." "That's what my mentor said," Caroline acknowledged, "that I could capture the spirit of a plant, not just its physical form." As dawn light filtered through the windows, Jacob emerged from his bedroll by the fire. Despite his advanced age, he moved with surprising grace, his eyes bright and alert. Without preamble, he joined them at the table and began examining Caroline's work. The old man's weathered fingers traced the outlines of an echinacea plant, lingering on the detail Caroline had included of its root structure. "You see beneath the surface," he commented. "Most only draw what shows above the ground. The most important medicinal properties are often in the roots," Caroline replied. "My grandfather taught me that." Jacob nodded approvingly, moving to another illustration, a detailed study of yarrow in various stages of bloom. "And this one, you've shown it in both summer and winter forms. How did you know to capture both aspects?" "I observed it through the seasons. Some plants change so dramatically that traditional classification systems treat them as separate species, but they're the same living entity in different phases." Thomas and Jacob exchanged another of their significant glances. "In our tradition," Jacob said, "we believe certain people are born with the ability to communicate with plant spirits, not through words, but through understanding that goes beyond observation." Caroline shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just a trained illustrator with a good eye for detail." "Perhaps," Jacob acknowledged, "or perhaps your training simply gave structure to a natural gift." He selected another illustration, a desert plant Caroline had drawn during their first weeks in Arizona. "This chaparral bush, you've included details that most scientific texts omit." Caroline looked more closely at her own work. "I draw what I see." "You see what others do not," Jacob corrected gently. "These structures here," he pointed to tiny glands she had detailed along the stems, "contain the plant's most powerful medicine. Traditional healers know this, but modern botanists often overlook them." Before Caroline could respond, the children began stirring, their voices ending the quiet conversation. The day's routines took over. Breakfast preparation, melting more, snow for water, checking on their supplies. The strange discussion about her illustrations was temporarily set aside, though Carolyn found herself pondering Jacob's words as she worked. Mid-morning brought a new challenge. 3-year-old Hannah, who had seemed merely tired the previous day, developed a worrying cough, her small body radiating heat that had nothing to do with the fireplace. "She has a fever," Caroline confirmed, anxiety sharpening her voice as she felt her daughter's forehead. "And her breathing sounds congested." Mary immediately came to examine the child, her movements confident and practiced. "How long has she been like this?" "The cough just started, but she's been unusually quiet since yesterday. I thought she was just overwhelmed by everything that's happened." Thomas joined them, his expression shifting from casual to professional as he observed. The little girl's flushed face and labored breathing let me listen to her chest. Using a small wooden tube from Jacob's medicine bag, a traditional stethoscope of sorts, Thomas carefully assessed Hannah's lungs. "There's congestion building," he confirmed. "Not pneumonia yet, but heading that direction if untreated." Panic fluttered in Caroline's chest. "We have no medicine, no way to get to a doctor." "We have medicine," Jacob interrupted calmly, already retrieving various pouches from his collection. "And healers." The next hours witnessed a different kind of education as the Redbird family mobilized to treat Hannah's illness. While Caroline held her daughter, Jacob directed the preparation of various remedies, explaining each step not just to William, as was his custom, but to Caroline and her older children as well. "This is Osha root," he told them, showing a gnarled, brownish root before adding it to a pot of simmering water. "It grows in mountain regions and helps the lungs clear congestion. We combine it with a small amount of creosote, yes, from the bush Elijah collected yesterday, for its infection-fighting properties." Thomas worked alongside his father, occasionally adding clarification in terms Caroline better understood. "Osha contains compounds similar to those in pharmaceutical expectorants, but with additional anti-inflammatory benefits." Together they created a steam treatment, placing the simmering herbs beneath a small tent of blankets, where Caroline sat holding Hannah. The aromatic steam filled the enclosed space, its camphor-like scent immediately opening the child's airways. "Have her breathe this for 10 minutes, then rest," Mary instructed. "We'll repeat every 2 hours." Between steam treatments, they applied a salve of melted pine resin mixed with fat and other herbs to Hannah's chest and back, and gave her tiny sips of a tea made from elderberry and another plant Jacob called desert sage. "The tea reduces fever and fights the infection," he explained. "The steam loosens congestion, and the salve keeps the chest warm and the medicines working through the skin." Caroline, trained to trust only pharmacists and physicians, found herself accepting these treatments with growing confidence as she observed her daughter's gradual improvement. By late afternoon, Hannah's fever had noticeably decreased, and her breathing came easier. "You know a great deal about treating illness," she said to Thomas as they prepared another batch of the herbal tea. "I was trained in Western medicine through my nursing education," he explained. "But I've learned as much, or more, from my father. On the reservation, we often combine approaches, sometimes out of necessity when clinics are understaffed or medications unavailable, but increasingly because we recognize the value in both traditions." As the day progressed, Caroline's other children became actively involved in Hannah's treatment. Jacob assigned each child a role. Sarah helped prepare the teas under Mary's supervision. Samuel collected and sorted the various herbs that Jacob required, and Elijah appointed himself Hannah's entertainer, keeping her distracted during treatments with stories and simple games. "Your children adapt quickly," Mary observed as they worked together, "especially Elijah. He has a natural affinity for our ways." Caroline had noticed this as well. Her usually restless son had become focused and helpful, absorbing Jacob's teachings with remarkable concentration. He was always the one who struggled most in traditional schooling. Too much energy, the teachers said, not enough focus. Some children need different forms of learning, Mary replied. In our tradition, such high-energy children are often recognized as having special gifts that conventional teaching cannot channel. Caroline considered this perspective, watching as Jacob patiently showed Elijah how to identify different herbs by smell when their appearance was similar. For the first time since his early childhood, Elijah appeared not just engaged, but genuinely centered in his learning. By evening, Hannah's condition had improved significantly. Though still ill, her fever had reduced to a mild elevation, and her cough had loosened, becoming productive rather than the dry, worrying hack of the morning. The child rested comfortably on Caroline's lap as the families gathered around them, fire for their evening meal. "Thank you," Caroline said, looking at each of the red birds in turn. "Without your knowledge, Hannah might have become seriously ill." "The plants did the healing," Jacob corrected gently. "We merely introduced them to her needs." As darkness settled outside and the snow continued its silent transformation of the landscape, Jacob turned the conversation in an unexpected direction. "Tomorrow, if Hannah continues to improve, I would like to show you something," he said to Caroline. "There is a small arroyo behind your property where several medicinal plants grow. Even under the snow we can find them." Caroline hesitated, glancing at her sleeping daughter. "I shouldn't leave Hannah." "Mary is fully capable of continuing her treatment for a short time," Thomas assured her. "And understanding the healing plants that grow on your own land may prove valuable long after we've gone." The suggestion carried implications Caroline wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging. That she would remain on this remote property rather than fleeing back to Chicago. That she might need to rely on such knowledge in the future. That her children's lives now depended on adaptation to this harsh environment rather than escape from it. Yet something in Jacob's steady gaze challenged her to consider these possibilities. "Your husband chose this land for reasons beyond its appearance," the old man said, as if reading her thoughts. "There is medicine here, for the body and the spirit. Tomorrow you will begin to see it." Later, as the household settled for the night, Caroline found herself standing at the window, watching the snow gently falling in the moonlight. The desert, transformed into this alien white landscape, seemed simultaneously more threatening and more magical than before. Thomas joined her silently, respecting her contemplation for several moments before speaking. "Your daughter will recover." "Fully," he said. "The treatments are working well." "I've never seen anything like it," Caroline admitted. "I was raised to believe in doctors and prescriptions, not roots and berries." Thomas smiled slightly. "And yet your grandfather had an herb garden that inspired your illustrations. That was different, more of a hobby, a connection to old-world traditions." "Is it so different?" he asked quietly. "Or is it simply that you were taught to value one form of knowledge over another?" The question lingered between them as they stood watching the impossible snow blanket the desert, each lost in thoughts about the strange convergence of circumstances that had brought their families together in this moment of shared survival and unexpected discovery. The morning of their third day together brought a significant change. The snow had stopped falling. A brittle blue sky stretched overhead, the sun casting diamond sparkles across the transformed landscape. The temperature remained below freezing, but the air held a crystalline clarity that seemed to sharpen every detail of the strange snow-covered desert. Hannah's condition had improved dramatically overnight. Her fever was gone, and though a slight cough remained, her energy had returned enough that she fussed to join the other children at breakfast rather than resting in her mother's arms. "The storm is passing," Thomas announced after checking the radio, "but the aftermath will last for days. Roads remain impassable, and temperatures won't rise above freezing until tomorrow afternoon." "Is that unusual?" Sarah asked, helping Mary wash the breakfast dishes. Snow in the desert, I mean. Very, Thomas confirmed. In recorded history, this area has never received more than a dusting that melted within hours. What we're experiencing is exceptional, nearly 6 inches accumulated. Jacob, who had been quietly observing the morning's activities, spoke up. The old stories speak of such times, when the desert wears white and the world is remade. They come perhaps once in many lifetimes. The children exchanged excited glances, clearly viewing the bizarre weather as an adventure now that the immediate dangers had been addressed. Caroline, however, recognized the practical challenges that remained. Their isolation, dwindling supplies, and the uncertainty of when normal conditions might return. After ensuring Hannah was comfortable with Mary and the other children, Caroline prepared to accompany Jacob and Thomas to explore the arroyo behind her property. Despite her lingering concern about leaving her youngest child, she recognized the importance of understanding the resources available on her land. The 3 adults set out mid-morning, following a path Thomas had cleared through the snow. Caroline wore layers borrowed from Mary. The Chicago winter clothing she'd brought to Arizona had proven inadequate for this unexpected freeze. There, Jacob said, pointing to a dry wash that cut through the landscape about a quarter-mile, behind the house. The arroyo catches rainwater during the brief monsoon season, creating a microclimate where medicine plants thrive. Caroline had never ventured this far from the house, her early weeks of widowhood having narrowed her world to the immediate surroundings needed for basic survival. Now, seeing the land through Jacob's perspective, she began to notice features she had overlooked. Even under snow, you can identify key plants by their structure, Thomas explained, brushing away white powder to reveal a small woody shrub. This is creosote, one of our most important medicines. It treats infections, breathing problems, and digestive issues. Jacob moved with surprising agility across the snow-covered terrain, occasionally stopping to uncover different plants, explaining their properties and uses, while Thomas translated the more technical aspects into terms Caroline better understood. Desert sage for fever and cleansing, Mormon tea for respiratory conditions and energy. Mesquite pods buried under this snow contain flour for baking when properly prepared. Caroline absorbed the information with growing interest, her artist's eye recognizing patterns and relationships between the plants and their environments. At one point, she surprised both men by identifying a partially snow-covered plant before they mentioned it. "That's devil's claw, isn't it?" she asked, brushing snow from a distinctive seed pod. "I illustrated it for a botanical journal once." Jacob's eyes crinkled with approval. "Yes, good for inflammation and pain. The roots are stronger medicine than the pods." As they continued their exploration, Caroline began to see the land differently, not as the harsh, unforgiving environment that had threatened her family's survival, but as a complex living system filled with resources she simply hadn't known how to recognize. "Your husband chose this location wisely," Jacob commented, as they paused on a small rise overlooking the property. "This land has good medicine." Frank was excited about the native plants, Caroline acknowledged. He talked about learning to live more sustainably, using local resources. I just didn't share his enthusiasm then. It all seemed so foreign, so intimidating. "Knowledge transforms fear into respect," the old man replied. "The desert demands both." Their conversation was interrupted when Thomas, who had walked slightly ahead, called them over to a sheltered area beneath an overhanging rock. Brushing away snow, he revealed a cluster of small, inconspicuous plants with feathery gray-green leaves. "Desert sage," Caroline identified, recalling their earlier lesson. "Yes," Jacob confirmed, "but a special variety that grows only in protected areas, more potent than the common type." He knelt with some difficulty, his aged joints protesting the cold, and carefully harvested a small amount of the plant, explaining, Proper gathering techniques as he worked. Never take the first plant you find, even in abundance. That one is the teacher, showing you what to look for. Never take more than 1/3 of any plant population. The rest must remain to reproduce. Caroline listened intently, recognizing the deep ecological wisdom in his approach, so different from the efficiency-focused agricultural practices Frank had been trained in, yet ultimately more sustainable. Thomas added practical insights. From his perspective, these principles have been validated by modern conservation biology. Indigenous harvesting practices maintained healthy ecosystems for thousands of years before the concept of sustainability became fashionable. As they made their way back to the house, their harvest bags containing small, carefully collected samples of various medicinal plants, Jacob asked Caroline a direct question. "What are your plans when the road's clear? Will you return to Chicago?" The question caught her off guard, though she'd been pondering it privately since their arrival. I'm not sure. Before you came, I thought we couldn't survive here. Now I'm less certain." "Survival is possible anywhere with proper knowledge," Thomas observed, "but thriving requires something more, a connection to place." "Do you feel that connection beginning?" Jacob asked, his weathered face serious. Caroline considered the in question honestly. "I feel something changing. When I first came here with Frank, I saw only emptiness and harshness. Now I'm starting to see patterns, relationships, life where I thought there was none." Jacob nodded as if she'd confirmed. "Something important. The land speaks differently to different people. Some never hear its voice at all. Others," he glanced meaningfully at her, "have ears already attuned, even if they don't recognize it." Back at the house, they found an atmosphere of industrious activity. Mary had organized the children into a workshop of sorts, teaching them to prepare various remedies from the supplies in Jacob's medicine bags. The dining table had been transformed into a processing station. Sarah carefully grinding dried herbs with a stone mortar and pestle, Samuel sorting different materials into small containers, Elijah stirring a pot of something aromatic that simmered on the stove, and even little Hannah, now well enough to participate, washing plant roots under Mary's supervision. "We're making medicine," Elijah announced proudly as they entered, "for when you have to leave. Mrs. Mary says we should have our own supplies." Caroline looked questioningly at Mary, who explained, "I thought it would be practical to prepare some basic remedies that you could keep after we're gone. Common treatments for fever, cough, minor infections, things that might be useful before you can reach town." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Caroline deeply. While she had been learning to identify resources, Mary had been ensuring she would have practical applications for that knowledge. "We labeled everything," Sarah added importantly, showing neatly written tags attached to small bundles of herbs and jars of salve. And Mrs. Mary wrote down all the instructions. Caroline examined the carefully prepared remedies, many utilizing the same treatments that had helped Hannah recover so quickly. The precise organization reminded her of her grandfather's meticulously arranged herb cabinet. "This is incredibly generous," she said, emotion tightening her throat. "Knowledge is meant to be shared," Mary replied simply, "especially when it might be needed." As the day progressed, Jacob directed a more formal teaching session, incorporating what they had gathered from the arroyo into the lessons. He demonstrated how to prepare various plant parts, which should be dried, which used fresh, which could be stored for future use, and which lost potency quickly. Caroline found herself drawing parallels to her botanical knowledge, occasionally adding scientific names or noting relationships between desert plants and their more familiar garden relatives. Rather than dismissing her contributions, Jacob incorporated them seamlessly into his teaching, creating a bridge between their different knowledge systems. By late afternoon, Thomas announced a new development from the radio reports. They've started clearing the main highways. If temperatures rise as predicted tomorrow, secondary roads might be passable by the following day. The news brought mixed emotions. While Caroline recognized the practical need for the roads to clear, their combined supplies wouldn't last indefinitely, and eventually the Redbirds needed to return to their own community. She felt unexpected reluctance at the thought of their departure. That evening, as the children played a game William had taught them involving stone pieces and a board drawn in the hearth ashes, the adults discussed more practical matters around the kitchen table. "When we leave," Thomas said, "you should consider coming to Copper Springs, at least temporarily. Winter isn't over, and another storm, even a normal one without snow, could isolate you again." "Is there somewhere we could stay?" Caroline asked, considering the suggestion. "I don't have much money for hotels." "Sheriff Bennett's wife runs a boarding house," Thomas replied. "They're good people, but there might be another option." He glanced at his father, who nodded permission to continue. "The reservation clinic needs help," Thomas explained. "Our regular doctor comes only twice monthly from Phoenix. Between visits, we rely on a nurse practitioner and local healers. Someone with your observational skills and knowledge of medicinal plants could be valuable, even in a limited capacity." Caroline blinked in surprise. "I'm not medically trained." "Neither are many of our most effective healers," Jacob pointed out. "Your illustrations show you understand plants in a way many trained botanists do not. That understanding can be developed into practical knowledge." Mary added practical considerations. "The position includes housing, a small cottage near the clinic. It's not luxurious, but it's well maintained and would accommodate your family while you decide on longer-term plans." The unexpected proposal stunned Caroline. "You're offering me a job based on a few days' acquaintance and some botanical drawings?" "We're offering an opportunity," Thomas clarified, "to continue learning what we've begun teaching you in an environment where such knowledge is valued and needed. And your children would have the support of a community," Mary added gently, "something I suspect you've been missing since your husband's passing." The conversation was interrupted when Hannah climbed into Caroline's lap, drowsy and ready for bed. As she cuddled her youngest child, Caroline gazed around the room, at Jacob teaching the stone game to her fascinated older children, at Mary preparing evening tea with practiced movements, at Thomas waiting patiently for her response. These strangers who had arrived at her door during the strangest weather event in Arizona's recorded history had become, in just 3 days, something she hadn't realized she desperately needed. Not just rescuers, but mentors, offering a path forward she hadn't imagined possible. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "Truly." Outside, the snow-covered desert reflected, moonlight in an ethereal glow, creating an otherworldly landscape of silver and shadow. The impossible snow that had threatened her family's survival had also delivered unexpected gifts, knowledge, connection, and perhaps a new beginning she hadn't dared to hope for. The 4th day dawned bright and clear, with temperatures noticeably rising as predicted. By mid-morning, patches of desert began emerging through melting snow, the strange winter wonderland gradually surrendering to reality. Water dripped from the ranch house eaves in a steady rhythm, marking time like a natural metronome. "The melt has begun," Jacob observed, watching from the porch where he sat in a rare moment of relaxation. "By tomorrow, much of this will be gone." Caroline joined him, Hannah balanced on her hip. The little girl had recovered completely, her cheeks pink with health rather than fever. "Like it never happened," she commented, surveying the transforming landscape. "The snow will vanish, but its water remains," the old man replied, "sinking into the earth, feeding roots that have waited patiently through drought. What appears temporary often leaves permanent changes." His words seemed to carry meaning beyond the literal, making Caroline wonder if he was speaking about the snow or their unexpected time together. Before she could ask, William and Samuel came running around the corner of the house, excitement evident in their faces. "Dad, a truck is coming!" William called to Thomas, who emerged from the barn where he'd been checking their vehicle. In the distance, a plume of dust marked the approach of a vehicle navigating the still, treacherous road. As it drew closer, Caroline recognized the Copper Springs Sheriff's Department emblem on its side. Sheriff Bennett himself was at the wheel, his weathered face breaking into a relieved smile as he parked and stepped out. "Mrs. Thornton, thank the Lord you folks are all right. We've been trying to reach you since the storm let up." "We're fine, Sheriff," Caroline assured him, stepping forward. "Thanks to the Redbird family. Their truck got caught in the storm, and they took shelter with
us."
Bennett turned to Thomas, recognition dawning. "Thomas Redbird, isn't it? From the White Mountain Reservation?" Thomas nodded, extending his hand. "Sheriff, good to see you again." "Likewise." They shook hands with the familiarity of previous acquaintance. "Your people been wondering about you. Radio service has been spotty, but they got word to us that you were overdue. Our truck is stuck about a mile down the access road," Thomas explained. "Too deep in a drift to extract without equipment." Bennett nodded, understanding. "I can arrange to have it pulled out tomorrow when the road crews make it this far. In the meantime, I'm checking on outlying properties. The storm was unprecedented. We've got stranded folks all over the county." He turned back to Carolyn. "Mrs. Thornton, I've got emergency supplies if you need them. Food, water, medical necessities." "We're managing well," Carolyn replied. "The Redbirds shared their provisions, and they've been teaching us about desert resources." She gestured to the drying herbs and prepared remedies visible through the open door. Bennett's eyebrows rose slightly as he took in the scene, clearly not what he had expected to find at a stranded widow's home during a weather emergency. "Well, that's good to hear." He cleared his throat. "The town's set up an emergency shelter at the community center for folks who need it. I can take you and the children back with me if you'd like." Caroline hesitated, looking back at the house where her other children were visible through the window, engaged in some activity with Mary. The sheriff's offer would have seemed like miraculous rescue just 4 days ago. Now it felt almost like an interruption. "I think we're fine here for now," she said finally, "but I appreciate the offer." Bennett seemed surprised but didn't press the issue. After confirming they had sufficient supplies and promising to send a tow truck for the Redbird's vehicle the following day, he departed with a final curious glance at the unexpected cohabitation. "You've known the sheriff before?" Caroline asked Thomas as they watched the patrol car disappear down the road. "Our paths have crossed professionally," he replied. "The reservation coordinates with county services for certain emergencies. He's fair-minded, treats our people with respect." Inside, the children were helping Mary prepare lunch, the kitchen filled with cheerful chatter. The meal they created together featured the last of their combined food stores, a hearty stew incorporating dried meat, desert plants, and the remaining vegetables from Caroline's pantry. As they ate, Thomas outlined their plans. If the roads continue to clear today and the tow truck arrives as promised tomorrow morning, we should be able to head back to the reservation by midday. The announcement, though expected, cast a subtle pall over the meal. The children exchanged glances, and even Jacob's normally serene expression showed a hint of regret. "Before we leave," the old man said, "there is one more thing I wish to teach you, Caroline, if you are willing." "Of course," she replied without hesitation. After the meal, while Mary and the children organized their belongings in preparation for departure, Jacob led Caroline to a sunny spot on the porch where the afternoon warmth had created a comfortable microclimate. From his medicine pouch, he removed a small, leather-wrapped bundle, unwrapping it to reveal what appeared to be a collection of seeds, roots, and dried berries. "These are the beginnings," he explained. what you would call starter specimens, plants that are difficult to find but important for healing. Caroline studied the collection with interest. Some she recognized from their expedition to the arroyo, others were entirely unfamiliar. These are not merely plants, Jacob continued. They are relationships. When you place them in the earth, you establish a covenant to care for them, to harvest with respect, to use their medicine in service to others. You're giving me seeds to plant, Caroline clarified, surprised by the formality of his presentation. I am offering you the beginning of a healing garden, Jacob corrected, something more intentional than wild gathering, a place where you concentrate the most important medicine plants close at hand. The significance of the gift began to register. Jacob wasn't simply providing practical resources, he was inviting her to continue the path they had begun showing her, to actively cultivate both plants and knowledge. This is very generous, she said, genuinely moved, but I'm not sure I know enough to maintain such a garden properly. You know more than you realize, Jacob replied, and the plants themselves will teach you if you observe closely. You're artists. I seize details others miss, the subtle changes in leaf coloration that indicate readiness for harvest, the specific patterns of growth that reveal a plant's condition. He proceeded to explain each specimen in the collection, appropriate planting conditions, care requirements, and medicinal applications. Caroline listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed her growing familiarity with the subject. You're a quick study, Jacob observed with approval. I have good teachers, she replied, and motivation I didn't have before. As the afternoon progressed, the clearing weather allowed the children outdoor playtime. A welcome release after days confined largely indoors. They engaged in an impromptu game of tag across the melting snow, their laughter carrying on the clear desert air. Caroline watched them from the porch, noting the easy camaraderie that had developed between her children and William. Even more remarkable was Elijah's transformation. Her normally difficult son had become almost a different child under Jacob's influence, focused, helpful, and notably more centered. Thomas joined her, following her gaze to where Jacob now sat with Elijah, apparently explaining something about a plant they had discovered at the edge of the yard. Your father has had quite an effect on my son, Caroline commented. Thomas nodded. Jacob recognizes certain qualities in children, what we would call medicine gifts. Elijah has the makings of a plant healer. He connects with growing things in an unusual way for his age. He's always been difficult in conventional settings, Caroline admitted. His teachers in Chicago suggested he might have attention problems, or perhaps he simply needs different forms of engagement. Some children learn through sitting still and listening. Others need to touch, to move, to directly experience. Caroline considered this perspective, so different from the standardized educational approaches she had accepted without question in their urban life. I never thought of it that way. As evening approached, Mary organized a special meal, using the last of their supplies to create what she called a friendship feast. The children helped prepare traditional Apache dishes alongside more familiar fare, creating a blend of culinary traditions that symbolized their time together. Before they ate, Jacob performed a brief blessing in Apache, then translated for Caroline's benefit. We give thanks for the snow that brought us together, for the fire that kept us warm, for the plants that healed, and for new friendships formed in unexpected circumstances. The meal was filled with conversation that ranged from practical advice about desert living to stories from both families' histories. The knowledge exchange continued, even as they enjoyed their food, Mary explaining preservation techniques that would work in the desert heat, Thomas discussing how to identify safe water sources during dry periods, Jacob sharing weather prediction, methods based on plant and animal behaviors. As they finished eating, Thomas addressed the practical aspects of their impending departure. "Once our truck is recovered tomorrow, we'll head back to the reservation. But this doesn't have to be goodbye." He glanced at Caroline. "Have you given any thought to our suggestion about the clinic position?" All eyes turned to her, including her children's. Caroline realized she hadn't discussed the possibility with them yet, having needed time to process it herself. "What clinic? Imposition?" Sarah asked immediately. Caroline explained briefly the opportunity to work with the reservation health services, learning more about medicinal plants while contributing her observational skills, the housing that would come with the position. "We'd live with the Apache people?" Samuel asked, his expression a mixture of curiosity and excitement. "Near them, yes, in a small house by the clinic." "I want to keep learning from Mr. Jacob," Elijah declared firmly. Hannah, picking up on the conversational energy, added her own enthusiastic "yes." Though she likely didn't fully understand the discussion, Caroline found herself touched by their immediate openness to the idea. "It would be a very different life than what we had in Chicago," she cautioned. "Simpler, more rural. This whole place is different from Chicago," Sarah pointed out with the practicality of her 10 years. "And we don't have anyone there anymore since Grandma and Grandpa moved to Florida." It was true. Frank's parents had relocated years earlier, and her own parents had died before the twins were born. Their connections to Chicago were primarily institutional: schools, their former neighborhood, her previous employer, rather than deep personal ties. "I haven't decided yet," Caroline said carefully. "It's a big change to consider." Jacob, who had been quietly observing the family discussion, spoke up. "Consider this. The greatest hardship often comes from fighting against the path that opens before you." His cryptic statement hung in the air as they finished the meal and cleared away the dishes. The evening settled into a now familiar routine. Stories by the fire, preparations for bed, the comfortable domesticity that had developed across cultural lines during their days together. Later, when the children were asleep, Caroline stepped outside alone, needing a moment to think in the crisp night air. The desert had transformed yet again. Much of the snow now melted, revealing the familiar landscape beneath, yet somehow it looked different to her eyes. Where she had once seen only harshness and scarcity, she now recognized subtle beauty and hidden abundance. Thomas joined her after a respectful interval, offering a blanket against the night chill. "It's still cold after sundown," he said, draping it around her shoulders. "Thank you." She pulled the blanket closer, looking out at the starlit desert. "For everything. You and your family saved us, not just from the storm, but from my own ignorance about how to live here." "You would have figured it out eventually," Thomas replied. "You're remarkably adaptable." "I'm not sure about that," Caroline admitted. "Before you came, I was planning our escape back to Chicago. I saw no future for us here." And now, she considered the question seriously. "Now I see possibilities I didn't before. Knowledge I need to acquire, resources I didn't recognize." Thomas nodded, seeming to understand the shift in her perspective. "The desert reveals itself slowly to those willing to learn its language." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the vast starry sky stretching overhead in brilliant clarity that the city had never permitted. "The clinic position," Caroline said finally, "is it really suitable for someone with my limited background?" "More than suitable," Thomas assured her. "Your observational skills and willingness to learn are exactly what we need. The technical aspects can be taught. The eye for detail and the connection to plants, those are rarer gifts." As they spoke, a meteor streaked across the night sky, a brief, brilliant flash that illuminated the desert momentarily before disappearing. "A sign," Thomas said softly. "In our tradition, when the sky offers fire during important conversations, it affirms the path being discussed. Caroline wasn't sure she believed in such signs, yet the timing was certainly striking. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow," she said. "Before you leave." Thomas nodded, respecting her need for final consideration. As they turned to go back inside, Caroline paused at the doorway, looking back at the landscape that had nearly claimed her family and had instead become the setting for unexpected transformation. The desert, neither enemy nor friend, but simply itself, waited with the patience of millennia for her decision. Morning arrived with the sound of engines, the promised tow truck lumbering up the now passable road to the ranch house. Caroline watched from the kitchen window as Thomas went out to meet the driver, their breath visible in the still cool air as they discussed the recovery of the Redbird's stranded vehicle. "They'll be leaving soon," Mary observed quietly, joining Caroline at the window. Yes. The simple acknowledgement carried a weight of emotions Caroline wasn't fully prepared to articulate. Mary seemed to understand without further explanation. Partings are difficult, but they don't need to be final. Inside the house, activity centered around preparations for departure. Jacob supervised the careful packing of his medicine supplies, enlisting Elijah and Samuel to help wrap delicate items in cloth and secure them in wooden boxes. The boys worked with surprising care, absorbing Jacob's final instructions about handling the various herbs and implements. Sarah helped Mary organize their personal belongings, while William entertained Hannah with a cat's cradle string game he had fashioned. The domestic scene struck Caroline with unexpected poignancy. How quickly they had adapted to each other's presence, how natural their interaction had become after just 4 days together. "Mom, where should I put these?" Sarah asked, holding up several carefully labeled packages of dried herbs Mary had prepared for them. "In the kitchen cabinet for now," Caroline directed. "We'll organize a proper place for them later." The casual reference to future organization revealed her unconscious shift in thinking. No longer was she planning an escape from this place. She was considering how to better inhabit it. By mid-morning, the tow truck operator had located the Redbird's vehicle and begun the process of extracting it from the snowdrift. Thomas reported that the truck appeared undamaged, though it would need thorough checking before being declared roadworthy. "They think it will be ready to drive by early afternoon," he informed the waiting families. The news accelerated their preparations, lending a sense of finality to the morning's activities. Caroline found herself creating unnecessary tasks to delay the inevitable, reorganizing supplies, cleaning already tidy spaces, double-checking preparations that needed no verification. Around noon, with the Redbird's belongings packed and staged near the door, Caroline called her children together in the living room. The moment for decision had arrived, and she wanted to include them in the process, even though she had largely made up her mind. "Before the Redbirds leave," she began, "we need to discuss something important as a family." The children arranged themselves on the sofa, their expressions attentive. "Thomas and Jacob have offered me a position at the reservation clinic, working with medicinal plants and helping with patient care." "Like a doctor?" Samuel asked. "Not exactly. More like a specialist in plant medicines, learning from Jacob while contributing what I already know from my illustration work." "Would we live there?" Sarah wanted to know. Caroline nodded. "There's a small house near the clinic that comes with the position. It would mean leaving this ranch, at least temporarily." "But we'd still be in Arizona?" Elijah clarified, his face showing concern that they might return to Chicago. "Yes, we'd still be in Arizona. The reservation is about 40 miles from here." The children exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. It was Sarah, always the most articulate, who responded first. "I think we should do it, Mom. This ranch is too far from everything," and she hesitated. "It reminds us of Dad in sad ways sometimes." Samuel nodded agreement. "And you seem happier learning the plant stuff with Mr. Jacob and Thomas." Elijah typically impulsive, was uncharacteristically thoughtful. Mr. Jacob said I could learn to be a plant healer too if we stayed nearby. He said I have the right kind of mind for it. Hannah, not fully comprehending the discussion but sensing its importance, contributed her own opinion. I like Mary, she stated simply, patting Caroline's arm with a small hand. Caroline felt a surge of emotion at their responses, a mixture of gratitude for their adaptability and a bittersweet acknowledgement of their collective resilience in the face of loss. These children, who had endured the death of their father and the uprooting of their familiar lives, were now embracing yet another change with remarkable openness. Then I think we have our answer, she said, gathering Hannah into her lap. We'll accept the position, at least for now. We can always reconsider later if it doesn't work out. The decision made, Caroline felt an unexpected lightness, as if a burden she hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted. When Thomas returned from checking on the progress with their truck, she asked to speak with him privately on the porch. The desert air had warmed considerably, melting snow, creating small rivulets across the yard. In the distance, the mountains stood clear against the azure sky, their features more distinct than she had ever noticed before. We've made our decision, she told him directly. We'd like to accept the position at the clinic, if the offer still stands. Thomas's expression warmed with genuine pleasure. It absolutely does. The clinic director will be pleased. We've needed someone with your observational skills for some time. I still have much to learn, Caroline cautioned. As do we all, Thomas replied. But you have a foundation to build upon. Your scientific knowledge, your artistic precision, and now the beginnings of traditional understanding. Jacob believes you have an unusual capacity to bridge these different ways of seeing. The mention of the elderly medicine man prompted Caroline to ask a question that had been forming in her mind. Your father has been particularly interested in teaching me. Why? There must be many people on the reservation with greater aptitude or connection to your traditions, Thomas considered her question thoughtfully. There are certainly those who have grown up in our ways, but Jacob says knowledge sometimes needs new vessels. He believes certain gifts appear where they're meant to, not always where tradition would expect them. He paused, then continued with greater specificity. He recognized something in your botanical illustrations, a way of seeing plants that goes beyond technical observation, the same quality he's identified in Elijah. A talent for drawing? Caroline asked, not fully understanding. A capacity to perceive the essential nature of plants, Thomas clarified, what our people would call their spirit or medicine. It shows in your artwork. You capture aspects that aren't visible to ordinary observation. Caroline thought about her lifelong fascination with plants, her ability to render their most subtle characteristics, the way she had always felt a particular affinity for the growing world even in urban Chicago. What she had considered merely artistic sensitivity was being described as something more significant, and Elijah has this same perception? Thomas nodded. Jacob recognized it immediately in how the boy interacts with plants. The questions he asks, the details he notices, it's quite rare, especially in one so young. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the tow truck returning, the Redbird's vehicle now attached to its rear. The driver gave Thomas a thumbs up, indicating successful recovery. It seems our departure is imminent, Thomas observed. If there's anything else you need before we leave— Actually, there is, Caroline replied. Practical details. When should we come to the reservation? What should we bring? Will there be paperwork for the position? Thomas smiled at her shift to pragmatic concerns. I can help with those questions. Let's go inside and discuss the arrangements with everyone. The next hour passed in focused planning. Thomas provided directions to the reservation and the clinic, information about the housing they would occupy, and details about the position itself. Jacob added recommendations about which of Caroline's recently acquired plant specimens should be transported and which could be harvested fresh upon arrival. Mary took Caroline aside to discuss more domestic concerns. What household items would be most useful, which supplies were readily available in the reservation's small store, and what might need to be purchased in larger towns beforehand. "The cottage is small but well maintained," she assured Caroline. 2 bedrooms, a living area, kitchen and bathroom. Basic furnishings are provided, and there's a good-sized yard for starting your medicine garden." As the Redbirds made final preparations to leave, Jacob presented Caroline with one last gift, a small leather-bound book filled with his handwritten notes and drawings. "A beginning," he told her, placing it in her hands with ceremonial seriousness. "Not to replace your own observations, but to supplement them until your knowledge grows." Caroline accepted the book with appropriate reverence, recognizing it as both practical reference and symbolic passing of knowledge. "I'll use it well," she promised. The moment of departure arrived with the afternoon sun high overhead. The Redbirds' truck, deemed roadworthy after inspection, was packed with their belongings. The 2 families gathered in the yard for farewells that felt significant beyond their brief acquaintance. Jacob spoke first, addressing not just Caroline, but all the Thornton children. "You have survived your first desert trial," he said, his weathered face solemn. "The unexpected snow that threatened also brought new understanding. Remember this. A pattern, challenge, and opportunity often arrive together." Mary embraced Caroline warmly. "We'll have a place ready for you. Come when you've prepared properly, without rushing. 3 days or a week. The timing is less important than arriving ready to begin this new path." William shook hands with Samuel and ruffled Elijah's hair with the easy affection of an older brother. "Next time I'll teach you how to track rabbits without disturbing them," he promised the younger boys. Thomas was the last to say goodbye, his manner both professional and personally warm. "Take inventory of what you have and what you need before traveling to the reservation," he advised Caroline. "Sheriff Bennett can help with transportation if necessary. We're only 40 miles away, but preparation matters." "We'll be ready," Caroline assured him. "And thank you for everything. I'm not sure we would have survived without your family's help." "You're stronger than you realize," Thomas replied. "The storm simply helped you discover it." With final waves and calls of farewell, the Redbirds departed, their truck raising dust as it navigated the now dry road away from the ranch house. Caroline and her children stood watching until the vehicle disappeared from view, the silence afterward emphasized by the sudden absence of the people who had transformed their understanding of desert life. "I miss them already," Elijah said quietly, expressing what they all felt. "We'll see them again soon," Caroline reminded him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But first, we have preparations to make." The remainder of the day passed in purposeful activity. Caroline began inventorying their possessions, identifying what was essential to bring to their new temporary home and what could be left behind. The children sorted through their toys and books with surprising maturity, making thoughtful decisions about priorities. As evening approached, Caroline prepared a simple meal from the supplies Sheriff Bennett had left them. The kitchen seemed strangely quiet without Mary's presence, the house emptier despite containing the same family members it had before the storm. After the children were in bed, Caroline sat at the kitchen table with Jacob's book, carefully reading, his precise notations about desert plants and their uses. The hand-drawn illustrations reminded her of her own work, though they emphasized different aspects, medicinal properties rather than purely botanical characteristics. On impulse, she retrieved her own portfolio and began a new drawing, a desert sage plant with particular attention to the aspects Jacob had identified as medicinally significant. Her artist's eye, combined with newly acquired knowledge, creating an illustration that bridged her previous work and her emerging understanding. Through the window, the desert night spread in star-studded brilliance, the impossible snow now largely melted back into the earth. The landscape remained the same one that had nearly claimed their lives days earlier, yet Caroline viewed it with transformed vision. Where she had once seen only harshness and scarcity, she now recognized patterns of adaptation and hidden abundance. The desert had not changed, but her perception of it had, perhaps the most significant outcome of the strange blizzard that had brought the Apache family to her door. Setting aside her drawing, Caroline stepped onto the porch for a final moment of reflection before sleep. In the distance, a coyote called, its voice echoing across the quiet landscape. Another answered from a different direction, their communication forming an ancient desert dialogue she was only beginning to understand. "We'll learn your language," she whispered to the darkened landscape. "All of us, in our own ways." The journey ahead would not be easy, adapting to reservation life, learning new skills, building relationships in an unfamiliar community. Yet for the first time since Frank's death, Caroline felt a sense of direction and purpose beyond mere survival. The desert, in its harshest moment, had delivered an unexpected gift, a new path forward, and the knowledge needed to walk it. The following days passed in a whirlwind of purposeful activity. Caroline approached their preparation with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her botanical illustrations, creating lists, organizing belongings, and making necessary arrangements for their temporary relocation. Sheriff Bennett proved unexpectedly helpful, stopping by 2 days after the Redbird's departure with information about the ranch house. "Mrs. Peterson in town handles property management," he explained, sipping coffee at Caroline's kitchen table. "Says you can keep the lease active with minimal payment while you're at the reservation. That way you don't lose the place if the clinic position doesn't work out long term." "That's very considerate," Caroline replied, relieved at this practical solution. The ranch represented Frank's dream, and though she was ready to explore a new direction, permanently abandoning this piece of him felt premature. "Folks around here look after each other," Bennett said with a shrug. "Desert living requires it." He hesitated, then added, "I was surprised about your arrangement with the Redbird family. Not many would have. Well, there's still some prejudice. In these parts," Caroline considered his diplomatic phrasing, "they saved our lives, Sheriff, and taught us more about surviving here than we could have learned in years on our own." Bennett nodded thoughtfully. "Thomas Redbird has a good reputation. Works with the hospital in Phoenix sometimes, I hear. Different approach to medicine, but effective in its way." His tacit approval seemed representative of a slowly changing perspective in the broader community. Before leaving, the sheriff offered to transport them and their essential belongings to the reservation when they were ready. A gesture Caroline gratefully accepted, as their own vehicle had limited capacity. The children approached the impending move with varying reactions. Sarah, practical and adaptable, organized her belongings efficiently, asking sensible questions about school arrangements at their new location. Samuel oscillated between excitement about the adventure and moments of quiet reflection, often sitting on the porch, looking at the desert landscape as if committing it to memory. Elijah displayed unprecedented focus, carefully selecting which plants from their yard to bring samples of, based on Jacob's teachings. His normally scattered energy had found a channel, resulting in a more centered, purposeful demeanor that continued even after the Redbird's departure. Hannah, too young to fully comprehend the changes, nonetheless picked up on the purposeful energy, helping by carrying small items around the house and declaring her readiness for the new place. 5 days after the Redbirds had left, Caroline received an unexpected communication, a letter delivered by a reservation resident who happened to be passing near their property. Written in Thomas's precise handwriting, it provided additional, Details about the clinic, their housing, and the community they would be joining. "The cottage has been prepared," he wrote. "Mary has stocked basic supplies, and Jacob has marked areas in the yard suitable for beginning your medicine garden. The clinic director, Dr. Harriet Wilson, is eager to meet you and discuss how your skills might best serve our patients." The letter concluded with a personal note. "Your decision requires courage to embrace an unfamiliar path when the familiar one has disappeared. Such choices reveal character more clearly than comfort ever could." The words resonated with Caroline as she surveyed the half-packed house. Their Chicago life seemed increasingly distant, like a story she had read rather than lived. The urban career woman who had reluctantly followed her husband's dream to Arizona had been transformed by grief, desperation, and finally, unexpected connection. On the morning of their departure, Caroline woke before dawn, drawn to the porch by some instinct she couldn't name. The desert spread before her in pre-dawn stillness, the air crisp and clear in a way unique to early morning. She stood watching as the first light touched the distant mountains, gradually illuminating the landscape in subtle gradations of color invisible to her eyes just days earlier. A movement caught her attention. A desert hare pausing near a creosote bush, alert but unafraid. Beyond it, a cactus wren called from atop a saguaro, its distinctive song carrying in the quiet air. The scene struck her with unexpected poignancy, this harsh, beautiful land that had nearly taken everything from her was now revealing itself as a place of unexpected abundance. "Mom?" Sarah's voice came softly from the doorway. "Are you okay?" Caroline turned to find her daughter watching her with perceptive eyes. "Yes, just saying goodbye to this view for now." Sarah joined her at the porch railing. At 10, her oldest child already displayed a wisdom beyond her years, honed by loss and adaptation. "It won't be forever. We can come back to visit, right?" "Yes, we can. This is still our place, too." Sarah nodded, satisfied with this balance between embracing change and honoring connection. After a moment, she asked, "Do you think Dad would understand us going to the reservation instead of staying here?" The question caught Caroline off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Of course, the children would wonder about their father's reaction to this significant shift from his chosen path. "I think," she said carefully, "that your father wanted us to thrive, not just survive. He brought us to Arizona because he believed in new beginnings. This is simply a different new beginning than the one he imagined." Sarah considered this, then nodded, with the solemn acceptance children sometimes show for life's complexities. He would have liked the redbirds, especially Jacob's stories. "Yes, he would have," Caroline agreed, putting an arm around her daughter's shoulders as they watched the sunrise together. By mid-morning, Sheriff Bennett arrived with his truck to transport them to the reservation. The loading process went smoothly, the family's essential belongings requiring less space than Caroline had anticipated. Their life had been simplified by necessity during the difficult months following Frank's death, and the impending move had further clarified priorities. Before leaving, Carolyn took a final walk around the property alone. In the side yard, she paused at a small plot where Elijah had carefully transplanted several medicinal plants according to Jacob's instructions. Anchor plants, the old man had called them, to establish their medicine in this place until they returned. Near the back porch, Hannah's tiny handprints marked a section of soil where Mary had helped her plant sunflower seeds. "So they'll be tall when we visit," the little girl had explained. These small acts of faith in future connection to this place moved Caroline deeply. Her children weren't abandoning their father's dream. They were extending it in ways he couldn't have foreseen. The 40-mile journey to the White Mountain Apache Reservation passed through dramatically changing landscapes, desert giving way to higher elevation pine forests as they approached the tribal lands. The children pressed against the windows of Bennett's truck, exclaiming over the transformation from the environments they had known. "The air feels different," Samuel observed as they entered the reservation boundaries, marked by a simple wooden sign. "Wetter somehow." "Higher elevation," Bennett explained. "More rainfall here than down in the Sonoran Desert. Makes for different plants, different weather patterns." Caroline listened to his explanation while watching the passing scenery with a botanist's eye, noting unfamiliar plant species and mentally cataloguing questions for Jacob about their medicinal properties. Their arrival at the reservation clinic created a small stir of interest. Several staff members emerged to greet them, including an energetic woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Dr. Harriet Wilson, the clinic director. "We're delighted you've accepted our offer, Mrs. Thornton," she said, shaking Caroline's. "And warmly. Thomas has told me about your observational skills with plants. We've needed someone to help bridge traditional and conventional approaches to patient care." The clinic itself was a modest building, surprisingly modern inside, despite its rustic exterior. Dr. Wilson led them on a brief tour, showing Caroline a small laboratory space that had been designated for her use, for documenting and preparing plant medicines, she explained. "Jacob will work with you here when he comes for his weekly sessions." Beyond the clinic, about 100 yards down a pine-shaded path, stood their new temporary home, a small cottage with weathered wooden siding and a covered porch. Mary Redbird waited on the steps, her welcoming smile a reassuring sight after the journey into unfamiliar territory. "We've been expecting you," she greeted them, embracing Caroline briefly before turning her attention to the children. "Everything is ready inside." The cottage, though modest, had been thoughtfully prepared. Basic furnishings arranged comfortably, fresh linens on the beds, and a kitchen stocked with initial supplies. The 2 bedrooms were small but adequate, one for Caroline and Hannah, another for the twins and Elijah. Most impressive was the yard, which had been partially prepared for Caroline's medicinal garden. Several beds had been cleared and marked, with small stakes bearing plant names, the soil amended and ready for planting. "Jacob's work," Mary explained as they surveyed the prepared space. "He spent 2 days arranging it according to traditional patterns, which plants should be neighbors, which need more sun or shade." "That's incredibly thoughtful," Caroline said, genuinely moved by the effort invested on their behalf. "He believes in your gift," Mary replied simply. "We all do." After Sheriff Bennett departed with promises to check on their ranch house regularly, the family began the process of settling into their new space. The children explored the cottage and yard with enthusiasm, discovering small welcome gifts Mary had thoughtfully provided: hand-carved wooden animals for the boys, a beaded bracelet for Sarah, and a soft leather doll for Hannah. As evening approached, Thomas arrived with Jacob, their visit creating a sense of continuity from their intense, shared experience during the storm. They brought a meal prepared by community members, a traditional welcome feast for new arrivals. "The clinic staff will officially meet you tomorrow," Thomas explained as they ate together on the cottage's porch. "Tonight is for settling in and reconnecting." Jacob, who had been quietly observing the children's exploration of their new environment, finally spoke directly to Carolyn. "You have questions," he stated, rather than asked. She smiled, acknowledging his perception. "Many. About the plants here. They're different from those near our ranch. The elevation changes everything." "Good," the old man replied with approval. "Questions mean the mind is open. Tomorrow we begin filling it with new knowledge." As darkness fell, the Redbirds prepared to leave. Before going, Jacob took Elijah aside for a brief private conversation that left the boy standing straighter, his expression serious but pleased. "What did he tell you?" Caroline asked after their visitors had departed. "That I'm going to be his special student," Elijah replied, a note of pride in his voice. "He says I have the right kind of mind for plant medicine." Caroline felt a surge of gratitude for the old man's perceptiveness. In their brief acquaintance, he had recognized something in her difficult middle child that conventional teachers had missed, a gift disguised as restlessness. That night, as Caroline tucked her children into their beds in the unfamiliar cottage, she was struck by how adaptable they had proven. In the space of a week, they had faced death in a freak blizzard, formed connections across cultural boundaries, and relocated to an entirely new community. Yet here they were, already turning this strange place into home through small rituals and familiar interactions. After the children were asleep, Caroline stepped onto the cottage porch, alone. The reservation. Night was different from the desert, cooler, scented with pine, the darkness deeper beneath the forest canopy. Unfamiliar stars peeked through branches overhead, their patterns requiring new learning to navigate. Yet something fundamental remained constant. The cycle of day and night, the changing seasons, the relationship between humans and the natural world that sustained them. These constants transcended cultural boundaries and geographic locations, forming the true foundation of survival. Caroline touched the small leather-bound book of plant knowledge Jacob had given her, which she now carried in her pocket as a talisman of sorts. Inside were generations of observations, carefully preserved and transmitted. Soon, her own notes would join them, adding another layer to this accumulated wisdom. 6 months earlier, when Frank had first proposed moving to Arizona, Caroline had reluctantly agreed for his sake, never imagining she would find her own purpose in this unfamiliar landscape. His death had seemed to destroy any possibility of meaningful life here, leaving her stranded in a hostile environment with 4 dependent children and dwindling resources. The freak blizzard that had threatened to claim their lives had instead delivered unexpected salvation, not just the physical rescue by the Redbird family, but the revelation of a path forward she could never have anticipated. In the harshest moment of desert survival, she had discovered not just the resilience to endure, but the capacity to thrive in new ways. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning the rhythms of the clinic, establishing their place in this community, beginning the formal process of studying with Jacob. The path would not be easy, requiring constant adaptation and openness to unfamiliar ways of knowing. Yet for the first time since Frank's death, Caroline felt genuine hope, not just for survival, but for something richer. The widow, who had faced starvation in an impossible desert blizzard, had found not only physical salvation, but a new purpose, one that honored both her own gifts and the unexpected teachers the desert had provided. As she turned to go inside, a nightbird called from the forest edge, an unfamiliar sound that nonetheless felt like welcome. Caroline paused to listen, recognizing that learning this new language of place would be lifelong work, a continuation of the education begun in crisis and now unfolding in possibility. "We're here," she whispered to the darkness, a declaration and a commitment. "We're ready to learn." From the forest, as if in response, the bird called once more, an acknowledgement of presence, an invitation to belonging. Caroline smiled and went inside to rest, prepared for whatever tomorrow might bring in this unexpected new chapter of their desert journey. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.